The Panopticon is something that is simply, yet incorrectly, described as a book. It is in fact a biography of the most sophisticated lifeform to ever exist. The book itself, however, doesn't physically exist. Rather, it is the culmination of all thought in the universe, recorded by the living consciousnesses of all of its inhabitants. But what is this sophisticated lifeform, and what is its importance? Today, I will dive into the origins of the universe I created for the basis of all my videos, including Space Pirate Saga and Quarian Saga, a world I have previously named the universe of Landstar, now the Panomniverse. Please keep in mind that this video is literally me reading my thoughts that I scribbled down onto a Google document, so I do apologize for anything that doesn't make sense. If there is a detail you're confused about, please comment below and I will reply in time. This video is going to be a long one, and I tried my best to set up as much backstory as I could for all the stories, but I'm afraid I ran low on time. Guess there'll just have to be a part 2 then, huh? I want to take a moment here to thank everybody for their support. This world and the stories in it mean everything to me, and I wouldn't have the confidence and passion to do this if it wasn't for all of you motivating me forward into making this into something truly special. So thank you. And now, without further ado, I introduce to you a badly written summary of the Panopticon. We begin in a place very far away from us, yet its name is known quite well. It is called Hell, and contrary to popular belief, it isn't a place of death and destruction, but quite the opposite. It is a place where the 7 planes of existence reside, where order, chaos, life, death, time, and distance are all made. The origin of which all of this comes from is beyond what we can understand, and for an undefined amount of time, Hell is all there was thought to be. Ultrafusion is the plane of life in Hell. Everything there lives or is alive. What that looks like is not entirely explainable. Some would argue that the plane itself is a living being of primordial sludge, and that's a pretty good theory. If everything there is absolutely alive, why wouldn't the plane itself also be alive? Some life thereof is in fact quite intelligent, and discovers the concept of cross-planal travel, the ability to travel between the planes of Hell. Some beings able to do this include the Phainanites, who would discover Quria, the plane of dreams, and 2 creatures called the Proto-Dragonus, who would be the first beings to enter the plane of chaos, or as the Phainanites perceive it, the plane of power, Untempera. Untempera is vast, unending energy, a plane where anyone can know anything, but not all can withstand its nature. The Proto-Dragonus are no exception. They aren't destroyed per se, but they are changed. What they once were, their ideals, their very beings, are reintegrated to suit the nature of Untempera. It is not known what the Proto-Dragonus were like before leaving the plane of life. Only those in Ultrafusion who met them would know, and sadly none are accessible. The Proto-Dragonus, now called the Chrono-Dragonus, live in Untempera and absorb a vast amount of knowledge. One of the things they learned about was of a being which existed outside of Hell, yet drew upon its energies. The Chrono-Dragonus, out of curiosity, went looking for this creature, crossing all of Hell in their search. Then, at the edge of all there was to know, they found it. What they found was far more than what they had learned of. This being was big and small, simple and complex, young and old. It expanded and contracted, and with each breath it made, time flowed backwards and forwards as it breathed in and out. And with each breath it made, the Chrono-Dragonus witnessed the internals of the creature as it drew upon the energies of Hell, all to perpetuate itself. To the Chrono-Dragonus this was beautiful, a perfect amalgamation of everything. But it wasn't enough for them. They wanted more of this creature, and so they devised a plan to break through the walls that separated Hell from this being, known as the Chasm of Sa. This would not be particularly hard for the immensely wise Chrono-Dragonus, who had already accumulated the knowledge to leave Hell itself, but what they didn't account for was the need to create a vessel, or a being, which could hold the immense power and knowledge the Chrono-Dragonus had collected, as they found that this being's interior followed very strict rules which governed its existence, and changed with each breath of time. Funny enough, these strict rules, which frustrated the Chronodragonus to almost no end, would be what we would call the laws of physics. However, while similar in nature, the laws of physics inside this creature were significantly different to our own. Not too different, but not so similar you couldn't tell the difference. When the Chronodragonus had successfully entered the creature in the form of what we would call dragons, they were further in awe by the complexity of the creature's internal structure. For inside the creature they found what the energies of hell had been extracted for. There, inside this vast, impossibly massive creature, they found life. The first lifeforms the two dragons had found were not the first life to exist within this being. What they had found were the Qatari, and the dragons learned a lot from them, including the idea of naming conventions, something they brought back with them to hell. And so the Chronodragonus gave themselves names. One went by the name Obadon, the other Viseroth. They also came up with a name for the creature that fascinated them to no end. The name they chose was Panomni, a name in our language which simply means all and every, for Panomni to us is, in fact, the universe itself. The dragons spent a lot of time discovering the cultures and worlds and life that Panomni had created, and with each breath Panomni made, a new iteration of life, culture, worlds, and even the very laws of energy itself were changed each time, which left the Chronodragonus with an unending curiosity. And that should be where the story ends, but sadly, one thing the Chronodragonus were ignorant of was the tears. In entering Panomni, the Chronodragonus made rips in the cosmic membrane of Panomni that left scars that wouldn't heal. Even in every new iteration, the scars remained. They were stains that were corroding and weakening the chasm's walls between Panomni and hell itself. Energies from Untempera began flowing into Panomni, further poisoning the majestic creature. And despite all its peaceful attempts to signal to the dragons to leave, they were completely oblivious. So Panomni had no choice but to force them out with its own cosmic autoimmune system. Panomni would send 3 avatars representing the past, present, and future of its iterations to create events that would drive the dragons back into Untempera. This plan worked for a time. The Chronodragonus noticed an increase in aggressive behavior in Panomni's most recent iterations, but thought nothing of it. However, they decided that the best way to learn all they could without interference would be to create more of themselves to make sure they didn't miss any details. And so, Obadon and Viseroth had 13 children together, who would all work in force against the hardships they might encounter inside Panomni. When the new dragons arrived, they proved to be quite effective against Panomni's avatars. No matter what they did, the dragons would seemingly team up with their other siblings and utterly destroy all opposition. At one point, one of the dragons, named Malavice, saw and almost killed one of the avatars. Panomni needed a new plan if it was going to take down the dragons. Titanicus, the demon machine god. The greatest achievement in mechanical science and artificial intelligence. A machine so large, so powerful, its very existence pushes the limits of the universe beyond what it is capable of withstanding, and yet it is the only hope Panomni has of defeating the dragons. The avatars set about making sure the first Titanicus came into existence. They went to Vishath, homeworld of the Moleics, who were the most technically advanced species at the time, and implanted the idea to create it. After it was created, the Moleics were surprised when 2 of the dragons, Zaron and Solanor, appeared and began to attack Vishath, believing the avatars to be there and wanting to snuff them out before they tried anything. Little did either of them know, the avatars were far from unprepared. Far above the attacking dragons, a shadow engulfed Vishath, as from behind a massive cloud of inconspicuous cosmic dust, formerly known as the Blot, emerged Titanicus. The dragons battled Titanicus for a quarter of the iteration's lifespan, and sadly, the dragons won. But to Panomni, this was expected. Panomni had made sure that the Titanicus AI was the most sophisticated to ever exist. Even after its demise, it would continue to exist in future iterations and learn from the previous ones. It would continue learning until either the dragons were killed or sent permanently back to Untempera. And so, with each new iteration, Titanicus would be created, fight, fall, and learn so that it could fight better next time. From the dragon's perspective, Titanicus was some other creature that was threatening to destroy the beauty of Panomni, and they weren't wrong for believing so. The strain Panomni had to endure in creating Titanicus was immense, and left behind its own marks. The dragons took this as a sign that Panomni was being attacked, and fancied themselves heroes, believing that they would no longer be attacked if Titanicus was destroyed. So they kept fighting. Iteration after iteration, the dragons would fight on as hard as they could, and Titanicus would lose over and over, but learning more each time. Eventually, after several hundred iterations, Titanicus finally had a chance of victory. The last war was stacked against Titanicus 15-1, but for the highly sophisticated AI, managing 15 battles was not an issue. The issue was how powerful the dragons actually were. The fighting was brutal and beyond destructive. Panomni itself would have been torn in half by the sheer power of it all. The Titanicus AI, however, knew to make sure that this would not come to pass. Even so, failure was to come, but fully expected. 10, the smartest of the dragons, successfully managed to launch an attack to rip out the central power system, shutting down Titanicus. The dragons celebrated by ripping into and destroying the different parts of Titanicus, until the AI triggered an auxiliary system. This system had been in development in secret with supervision from the avatars of Panomni, and its purpose was to trigger an iteration restart, a system which would force Panomni itself to breathe in, sucking in all energy into one singular point, dragons included, and releasing it back out into a new iteration, all in one big bang. The result would scatter the dragon's beings and energy across Panomni, where it would dissolve in time and become part of Panomni itself. From Panomni's perspective, it was what the dragons had seemed to always want, to truly be a part of the worlds they loved so much. At the center of it all would be the brain of Titanicus, the AI who had worked so hard and died so many times, all for the sake of a creature it barely understood. But either by its own programming, or if perhaps it was something that could be perceived as real, the Titanicus AI loved Panomni, and would do anything to end its gargantuan pain. As the process began, it was clear to Obadon and Viseroth that something was wrong. In an effort to save their children, they opened a new tear and sent their children home to Untempera. They too were about to leave, but unlike in Untempera, they didn't have enough time. Titanicus may not have been able to kill all the dragons, but it did manage to kill the first two. Back in Untempera, witnessing the death of their parents, the 13 remaining Chronodragonis swore vengeance against Titanicus and vowed to stop at nothing to prevent Titanicus from ever existing again, even if it meant the destruction of worlds, which was something Obadon had previously been very clear never to do after the unprovoked attack on Vishath. The last Titanicus had been destroyed, but not to the point of absolute disintegration. The robot's various body parts were actually still very much intact, and would float into and become a part of individual galaxies in the new iteration. The head would go to the Milky Way galaxy. The chest would become the heart of Hoag's object, while the actual heart itself floated aimlessly in the main star ring. The arms would encircle the Andromeda galaxy, and the legs would interrupt the gravitational forces of 2 galaxies and become Mayal's object. What wouldn't be an intact part of Titanicus, at least for very long, was the AI itself. The process of dying and reforming over countless iterations of worlds had taken a toll on the ancient god. As a last-ditch effort to protect itself so that it could be rebuilt even stronger, the Titanicus cerebral AI fragmented itself, giving commands to individual fragments to either protect Titanicus remains, to hinder the dragons if they were ever found, or to attack and destroy anything containing energy from Untempera. but the cerebral AI had been damaged in such a way that these commands, when delivered, were either corrupted or misinterpreted. And so the fragments floated around aimlessly, trying to make sense of the message. Some would move on from the message and push it away, a nagging thought of what was left behind. Others would go crazy in deciphering a message that it had no other pieces to. Panomni's newest iteration was strange, to say the least. The energies from the last iteration, thanks to Titanicus, had crossed over, and now there was old energy mixing with new energy, creating many different kinds of life. The first of this brave new life was the Arkhans, a race that evolved possibly too quickly. They were technologically light years ahead of their time in comparison to any previous race to exist in Panomni, and as such, both Panomni and the Chronodragonus saw them as a possible threat to Panomni's life. The Chronodragonus believed that the Arkhans would bring Titanicus back much sooner than anticipated, and Panomni noticed that the Arkhans had taken an interest in an artifact called the Eye of Viseroth, a piece of the father of dragons, which could tear a pathway into hell. So ironically enough, both the avatars of Panomni and the Chronodragonus, without knowing, worked together to set events in motion to divide the Arkhans into factions that would seek out different things and evolve separately. Such events included increasing the needs of their expanding civilization, which would cause an increase in poverty and crime. They also introduced plagues and caused the destruction of the Arkan homeworld Brinshaw. This caused the Arkhans to split into factions, as intended, and would eventually evolve to become the Ulyssians, the Jormungandrians, and the Razorlights. The Razorlights would still seek a way into hell to find true peace and happiness in the plane of Kenya through a device called the Gates of Galash. It is unclear if they ever succeeded, since the avatars intervened to prevent more tears into hell. They did this by essentially cursing the Razorlight homeworld with unending war. The result would be thousands of dead civilizations burying any trace that the Razorlights ever existed. The Gates of Galash themselves were destroyed as well. All that remained was a single mechanical being that would desperately try to warn anyone from coming near the ridden planet. The Ulyssians became brave warriors and developed strong telekinetic abilities. As Arkhans, they were heavily interested in weapon technology. As Ulyssians, they would explore the galaxy and use their weapons in what they would consider a fun and creative way, but for them, the only desire stronger than their sense of adventure was their sense of family. They were saddened when the Razorlights left and were in mourning when they disappeared. Because of this great sadness, they chose never to go near Riseli and stuck quite close to their brothers, the Jormungandrians, who were more than happy to stay where they were. And so both the Ulyssians and the Jormungandrians lived peacefully together on the planet reforged from the remains of the Arkan homeworld, formerly Brinshaw, now Ulysses. The Jormungandrians were the ones Panomni was most afraid of. They were the ones who knew about the Eye of Viseroth and still had access to it. The specific one who owned it was a king named Yggdraxima. A tinkerer in his youth, Yggdraxima rallied the Jormungandrians when the Avatars and the Dragonus caused the separation of the Arkhans. To make sure Yggdraxima never touched the Eye of Viseroth, the Avatars tried to distract him as best they could away from the artifact. One of the things they did was encourage Yggdraxima into establishing long-lasting peace talks with Emperor Stellius of the Ulyssians, which would cause the budding of a strong friendship, as well as give Yggdraxima a mountain of political paperwork. This friendship would unfortunately backfire in the faces of the Avatars when Stellius would ask Yggdraxima to take a break from his busy work schedule and go back to his hobby of tinkering. This would lead to Yggdraxima rediscovering the Eye of Viseroth and becoming the first being from Panomni to venture into Untempera. Untempera to us cannot be described. It is a place beyond our comprehension, beyond our understanding of space and time, a place of pure, chaotic energy, which is why, when Yggdraxima entered Untempera for the first time, he was quite frightened and relatively quick to leave. When he returned to Ulysses, he discovered that he had brought back with him some kind of residue that was all over his form. Carefully scraping it off, he learned he could shape this residue into a pair of spheres, one made of pure white light, the other made of absolute darkness. The two spheres fed off each other in an unending loop, but what was most interesting was how the effect resulted in a strong source of unending power, untempic power. Excited and proud of his discovery, Yggdraxima rushed off to tell his close personal friend Stellius about his findings. Stellius was delighted and believed that this energy source could save the many crises currently faced on Ulysses. Stellius encouraged Yggdraxima to continue his research before making any official changes to their society, and Yggdraxima agreed. Back in his private workshop where he had the Eye of Viseroth, Yggdraxima used the Eye to open another tear and siphon energy from Untempera and into the spheres which he had dubbed the Lightmaster Engines. The more raw untempic energy was siphoned from Untempera, the bigger the Lightmaster Engines became, the more untempic power they could produce. Until, while during the siphoning process, one of the Chronodragonis broke through the siphoning point. It was Ten, and he wasn't too keen on this lifeform who had been stealing power from his home, as well as using the eye of his deceased father to do it. But Ten was no brute, and could see that this lowly being was bright if a bit naive. Ten offered Yggdraxima a choice: return the Eye of Viseroth and all energy siphoned from Untempera and never try to meddle in their affairs again, or he and every other Jormungandr would be taken to a place in Untempera where they could learn of its true nature in a way they could better understand it. To Yggdraxima, this choice was more of an ultimatum. He couldn't turn his back on an energy source that could solve a majority of the problems the citizens of Ulysses faced, so he agreed to go to Untempera. He hoped that, once inside, his race might be able to return if they wanted. If not, well, maybe they could find their own way back home. Unfortunately for Yggdraxima, this became a trap. The ignorant Ten had planned to show the secrets of Untempera to the Jormungandrs, but upon arriving in Untempera, Ten was caught by his brother, Zaron, who took the Jormungandrs from Ten. The Chronodragonis follow a prime directive of sorts, set unto them by their loving parents. Never interfere with the life in Panomni, only learn and study. Zaron took this directive to heart ever since he violated it many iterations ago on the Moleic homeworld, Vishath. Zaron believed that if he hadn't attacked Vishath, Titanicus would not have been brought online, and the chain of events leading to the death of Obadon and Viseroth never would have happened. So, naturally, taking his beloved parents' memory in heart, Zaron stopped whatever it was Ten was trying to do, and to further make sure that the Jormungandrs were not a threat to Panomni, as well as punish Ten, he melded them together into a being that would not want to leave Untempera and would perceive Untempera as its home. This would start a clashing rivalry between Ten and Zaron, and, in retaliation for what Zaron had done, Ten returned the Eye of Viseroth to Ulysses, in hopes that perhaps the Ulyssians might get some closure for what had been done. Back on Ulysses, Stellius was horrified by the sudden disappearance of every single Jormungandr, including his friend Yggdraxima. This event would spark panic for the Ulyssians, who hated losing their families and saw the Jormungandrs as close and personal allies and brothers in arms. The Eye of Viseroth to the Ulyssians was sadly only ever seen by them as a symbol of the Jormungandr's disappearance and nothing more. They couldn't figure out how the eye worked, not without the aid of the Jormungandrs or Yggdraxima's research. It was painful to even look upon. Stellius commanded his armies to scour the galaxy, the universe if they had to find their brothers, believing they must be out there somewhere. Stellius himself would also be on the front lines, looking for Yggdraxima. On his journey, he would stop at a planet called Esselheim when he detected strange energy spikes across the planet. He descended to the surface with some of his men and found a race of self-assembling robots called the Jotans. These Jotans were craftsmen by trade, and were happy to have the Ulyssians around to sell their wares and show off what they had made. However, Stellius had noticed something. The things the Jotans were making were the things the Jormungandrs had plans for or had already made themselves. They even had the same names. In the eyes of the Emperor, Stellius believed this to be highly offensive, as if the Jotans were grave-robbing the Jormungandrs, stealing their ideas and calling them their own. This fact partnered with the seemingly disrespectful and straightforward nature of the Jotans, which came off as abrupt and rude, led from arguments to eventually a war which would spread across half the galaxy. No longer were the Ulyssians exploring the universe for their brothers. Now they were exploring territories to go to war with the Jotans. Rovath and Sindora are the names of the creatures melded by Zaron. They were peaceful beings, and as such were left alone by the Chronodragonus for the most part. They were forge masters with all the tools they could ever want in Untempera. They would make many artifacts out of the collective ideas of the Jormungandran people. The culmination of their work was a sentient robot Rovath referred to as a Jotan. These Jotans revered Rovath and Sindora as gods. Rovath and Sindora weren't exactly sure why, but they decided to send the Jotans into Panomni, a race of their own design. Maybe they did this as a cry for help. Maybe they just wanted the Ulyssians to take the Jotans as a goodbye present from the Jormungandrans. Panomni didn't seem to mind. Compared to what the Chronodragonus had done, this was quite tame. The Jotans had a low level of untempic energy in them anyway, low enough at least for Panomni not to care. The one thing no one sadly expected was war. The Jotan-Ulyssian War would rage across half the Milky Way galaxy. The Ulyssians were immortals, but the Jotans were adaptable and could find alternative ways of thinning their numbers. Some ways included trapping them inside celestial bodies or cutting off their limbs so that they may never draw their weapons. It was a brutal war. Panomni was no stranger to its creations being at war. War is merely another system of regulation inside the impossible being. This war, however, was important to Panomni. Not because the Chronodragonus were involved, but because the weapons being used were physically destroying Panomni's energies, which by our laws of physics should not be possible. Despite their best efforts, Panomni and its avatars couldn't stop the war. Even the Chronodragonus wanted the war to end, as they feared it might cause the creation of a new Titanicus. The personalities of the two races were far too different from each other. The only way the war would end is if one side was completely and utterly destroyed. The Chronodragonus, furious at Rovath and Sindora for creating the Jotans, and by proxy the war itself, demanded that they come up with a way to end this war. Rovath, horrified at what had happened, asked the Jotans to bring him the Eye of Viseroth. His plan was to recreate the Lightmaster engines and use it to create warriors of Untempera that would side with either the Ulyssians or the Jotans. They would, in turn, annihilate the opposition. The Jotans sent out a small infiltration party to the planet of Ulysses to locate the Eye and spy on the Ulyssians. While they were there, they found out about a device the Ulyssians were making called the Ultrafusion. This device, when it made contact with a star, would force a supernova to occur, destroying the orbiting system in the process. After retrieving the Eye of Viseroth, the Jotans headed home as fast as they could to warn their leaders, but were ambushed by the Ulyssians on their way back. This was because Panomni, who was well aware of their movements, realized what it was the Jotans, Rovath and Sindora were all planning to do, and wanted to make sure that no more untempic energy would be brought into the conflict, as it had already done so much damage thus far. And so Panomni's avatars alerted the Ulyssians of what was happening. The Jotan infiltrators fought hard against their attackers, but didn't have the firepower to take the Ulyssians out. The Ulyssians slaughtered them with their terrifying telekinetic abilities that could shatter moons. When they boarded the ship to search for the Eye, however, they found out that the ship was on a timer for self-destruction. Despite it not being enough to kill all of the Ulyssians, it is worth noting that one single Jotan managed to board an escape pod and evade the Ulyssian sensors while they were distracted by the exploding ship. This escape pod would not go back to Esselheim, but instead veer off course thanks to the shockwave of the explosion and far out into uncharted space. It is believed that the Eye of Viseroth was with this Jotan in the pod, but either way, the Eye was lost forever. And so the Ulyssians returned home. Meanwhile, in Untempera, a new creature would appear from Oculteroth, the Serophoids. These beings, like the Dragonus before them, would be changed by Untempera, but in a rather peculiar way. Rather than seeking knowledge, the Serophoids sought justice and righteousness. They would be the ones to discover that at the end of all life is the plane of nothingness itself, something we would refer to as Darkstar. where the souls of the newly deceased would dissipate away and cycle back into Okhultaroth to be a part of a new form of life. They would deem this ultimatum of life as unfair and create the Soul Stream, a filter that would allow the Serophoids to pick out the souls of those who had led a good life. The Phainanites, now called Quarians, would call them Guardian Angels. These Guardian Angels would serve to make more of their kind by guiding the Quarians from the shadows on a path of morals and justice. The Serophoids would establish a portal between the planes of Untempera and Quria, where the Soul Stream would be located, and they would refer to this place as Heaven. They would also go by the title of Archangel Council to establish a hierarchy among the Guardian Angels they created. But the Quarians were not the only ones to be turned into Guardian Angels. Through the scars left by the Chronodragonus, an angel named Luna could see directly into Panomni. He too was fascinated by the beauty and diversity of life inside Panomni. Specifically, he was fascinated by a particular race of beings called humans. Unlike the Dragonus, however, he could not understand the physical limitations needed to be placed upon himself to enter Panomni, and so he found a new way to communicate with the humans through their minds. After finding out that the souls of humans also dissipated in Darkstar before being sent back into Okhultaroth, the Archangel Council collectively decided to make the just human soul into Guardian Angels as well. What they found was that human-based Guardian Angels were far more powerful than Quarian Guardian Angels, but what they didn't realize was that humans react quite strongly when exposed to untempic energy. Their minds become unstable if the energy isn't regulated properly, and so, not long after, the first demon was born. Luna, who didn't agree with the idea of making humans into Guardian Angels and felt responsible for all of this, had abandoned the Archangel Council and became a fallen angel who found his way into Panomni, where he could reside as a silent watcher from the moon named after him. The first demon's creation was chaotic, to say the least, but a demon he was nonetheless, and he would cause the most devastating war in all of Earth's history, the Tectonic War. This demon would turn all the human-based Guardian Angels into demons and wage war against Luna by driving his precious humans into madness and forcing them to attack each other. With the other demons, he would also cause the continents to shift positions and form one giant continent. Luna knew that all he had to do to end the war was to kill the first demon, but he lacked the strength to do it. The first demon was once a human he looked upon with fondness for his loyalty and commitment to cause. Killing that which he developed such a strong friendship for was out of the question, but the more the war raged on, the more he came to realize he had no choice. Eventually, Luna ended it, and after witnessing this sacrifice, Panomni itself gave Luna a gift to help him rid the Earth of future influence from Untempera. Using its own energy, Panomni infused Luna with the first demon's life to create a new being, Lunar Eclipse. This new being would be able to communicate with Panomni and understand what needed to be done. Lunar Eclipse scattered the demons across space and time and cut them off from Untempera to further reduce their power. Together they were dangerous, but apart they were mere tricksters and nothing more. Lunar Eclipse then returned to Untempera and blocked the access of human souls to the Archangel Council. No longer would they be able to make Guardian Angels from pure human souls. Lunar Eclipse, after completing his mission, would go to Quria, where he'd become the Protector. The Quarians would refer to Lunar Eclipse as the Spirit of Night and Day, maintaining the timeline there and preventing as many tears as possible between Panomni and Quria, as the chasm walls between dreams and reality had begun to weaken further. Back on Earth, the human race was confused. 500 years of madness from the demons had faded, and not much was known about what happened. All that remained were floating memories and corrupted archives of information. Despite all the human race had been put through, however, they managed to persevere through the endless strife. Humans, despite the infighting, despite primal nature, despite the destruction and reconstruction of the ground on which they stood, humankind survived. No other race who has been influenced in such a way can truly say that. Panomni itself was impressed with them. They had re-established communities on the newly reformed land, Pangaea, and had 23 zones, all with different ways of governing to suit different people's needs. At the top of the food chain was the UCP, the United Council of Pangaea, which had all the leading representatives from each of the zones. Together, they would make executive decisions on how to best avoid ever going to war again, as a 500-year war of pure madness was enough to make anyone think that maybe petty differences are just not worth fighting about. Outside forces were at work, however, and on the eve of June 12th, 6167, a man living on his own in the fields bordering between the zones of Sunstroke and West America would officially encounter the first alien life form in human history, as it fell from the stars and smashed into his house in a Yotan escape pod. The Recluse and the Yotan. Who would have thought that such a pair would make such a fierce friendship, or that together these two small lifeforms would be the ones to save humanity? Brandhelm, after his crash, was severely damaged, but he was fortunate enough to have crashed into the home of a young scientist named Jeffrey Barnard. Unable to fix Brandhelm, Jeffrey repaired him in a way that changed him in the process. Sadly, not all of Brandhelm's memories could be recovered, and his name and purpose were lost forever. Instead, Jeffrey gave him the name Ryan, after the constellation of Orion, of which he had appeared to fall from. Jeffrey would teach Ryan about humanity, and Ryan would glean knowledge from his limited memory about the Yotans. Ryan would also eventually show Jeffrey the Eye of Viseroth, but the two wouldn't use it. The artifact had a menacing aura about it, and both were uncomfortable with what it might do, as neither had any way of knowing. All they knew is that it contained a great energy inside. Ryan, instead, would introduce new technologies to Jeffrey, and Jeffrey would scrounge up any and all resources together to try and build it. The two would then pawn off the inventions to companies throughout the 23 zones of Pangaea. This would be their life together for around 20 years, but what they didn't realize was that the Yotan escape pod had a distress signal beacon, which had been active for all that time, and a Ulyssian scout had picked it up. The scout's name was Stellius. She was a direct descendant of the Emperor, and fresh from the training grounds of the Starfield Romanicus, where the Ulyssians learned to fight. Her mission was a simple exploration mission to find new grounds upon which to wage war for the Ulyssian Empire. Upon seeing the Yotanic distress signal on her own ship's radar, she took it upon herself to investigate. Despite the fact that she acted without consulting her leading officer, she believed that this would be her big break. Finally, something that would get her noticed by her military superiors and as an honored member of her lineage. What she found was what she considered at the time to be much less than what she had hoped for. Stellius was appalled at the state of Ryan. From her perspective, she had always viewed the Yotans as a mechanical menace to all of creation, and this was her adversary? A Yotan remade worse through the eyes of a mere mortal? Stellius confronted Ryan and challenged him to fair combat. She had her honor, despite wanting to end the life she believed he was suffering from. Ryan had strong biases against Stellius as well, but respected her offer for fair combat. Jeffrey protested, saying that Ryan would be risking his life for no reason. Even so, what else could Ryan do? The Ulyssians take no prisoners, they only take lives. So Jeffrey asked Ryan if there was anything he could make to help Ryan win the fight. Ryan knew that no matter what, he wouldn't be able to permanently trap, let alone kill Stellius, so the plan was for Ryan to immobilize her and talk her down, and Jeffrey would provide the necessary modifications to make that happen. Stellius, on the other hand, had only one goal in mind: kill Ryan. Her goal was to rip the steel framework of the abomination in half and make it bleed as her ancestors had done to countless other Yotans. Both actually did manage to achieve their goals. Stellius managed to grab Ryan and, with her bare hands, ripped the Yotan in two. This was not the end for Ryan, however, as despite the immense pain he was in, Ryan pushed through the pain and managed to knock Stellius down and pin her to the ground. Ryan then asked Stellius to hear him out. Stellius, still trying to process what happened, agreed. Ryan explained to Stellius that he was no longer going to associate himself with the Yotans. He was a changed being who only sought a peaceful life and believed that humans would not want to fight in any more wars. Stellius retorted by saying that war is an inevitable fact of any species, that humans themselves will probably fight in countless wars to come amongst themselves, given enough time. Ryan was just trading one for another. Ryan didn't believe her. He had learned of human history and said that humans are mortals and as such would not want to waste their lives waging more wars. Stellius finally said that even if what he was saying was true, it was only a matter of time before the war of the Jotuns and the Ulyssians reached Earth. Their war was always expanding into new territory, both sides desperately trying to counter each other. Eventually they would find Ryan, even if Stellius lied to her commanding officers about killing Ryan. Then everyone would be in trouble. Earth would be purged and destroyed in order to kill Ryan and remove any trace of the Jotanic scum, and Stellius would be court-martialed before her ancestors no less. Ryan knew Stellius was right. He needed a plan. He wanted to save these humans who had no part in a war that was going to kill all of them. Ryan realized the situation he was in and believed that this was truly all his fault. So he resigned himself to an ultimatum. Save humanity, or die trying. He offered Stellius a deal. He said, "Help me save humanity, and I will give you my life." Stellius was stunned. Her whole life she had believed that the Jotuns had no honor, yet here was a Jotun who not only chose to accept a fight of honorable combat, but held himself accountable for his actions and those of his former race, and was willing to strike a deal to save a race of mortals. Stellius couldn't refuse. She told herself she didn't refuse because it would put her in a good position to show that she killed a Jotun in hiding, but in reality, it was because she respected this Jotun for what he was willing to do. So Stellius asked the important question, "What are you going to do?" Ryan had a plan that would reshape the foundations of human civilization. A plan that would carry humanity forward into space and create an advanced class of people that would far exceed any society made on Earth. At the time, however, Jeffrey thought this was a bit extreme. Stellius couldn't help but laugh. The plan was to build a world or a ship that could provide the necessary living conditions for the people of Earth and leave the solar system far behind. Ryan believed it could be done. He knew of the Ulyssian telekinetic powers and watched them in action firsthand during the attack on his former ship. Stellius could build the ship, Jeffrey would lead humanity onto the ship, and Ryan would provide the power source. Stellius asked what Ryan could possibly have that would provide power to a ship this big. Ryan, probably due to a forgotten memory, had the instinct to not tell Stellius he was holding on to a stolen Ulyssian relic. He simply told her not to worry and said that he would meet any energy requirements she needed. He didn't know this for sure, but he felt he could figure it out. Stellius was incredibly suspicious of this, but Ryan hadn't given her a reason not to trust him so far, so she got to work in using her magnificent powers of telekinesis to build a ship that would meet Ryan's expectations. Jeffrey would try to convince the UCP that the evacuation of the planet was needed, and that there was a ship being designed that could save everyone. This went over about as well as expected. Jeffrey wasn't exactly an official member in the houses of science on Pangaea, let alone a respected one. However, his inventions for the people of Pangaea did not go unnoticed, so the council gave him the time to let him make his case, and even investigate for possible proof of his claims. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, they confirmed that Jeffrey was right when a large Ulyssian battle fleet was spotted near the ruins of Jupiter Extra, a human colony before the Tectonic War. They agreed that something needed to be done and gave Jeffrey their full attention. Ryan had the strangest task. While the others set about their tasks, his was simply to investigate the relic he had hidden for the last few decades. Eventually, he discovered that the eye was no power source but a portal, and when he stepped through, he found himself before his former gods, Rovath and Sindora, both who believed that this strange-looking Jotun had come to return the Eye of Viseroth to them. They congratulated Ryan, but then Ryan told them he had not come to return the Eye, but to plead for help. He needed a source of power to save the humans of Earth. Rovath and Sindora saw no point in saving a race of mortals that would die out anyway. All that mattered to them was ending the conflict between the Ulyssians and the Jotuns. They told Ryan of their goals to use the Lightmaster engines to create warriors of Untempera that would tip the scales of the Jotan-Ulyssian War. Ryan told them that the war between the Ulyssians and the Jotans were creating countless casualties. Who knows how many more millions were killed for simply being in the crossfire of such juggernauts. And to add this new breed of warriors on top of that? Who would really win in the end? Rovath and Sindora fell silent. All this time they had just wanted to fix their mistakes as quickly as possible. Yet here stood before them one of their own creations telling them that what they were doing was wrong. Perhaps it was a wake-up call for them. They told Ryan that they were going to make the Lightmaster engines and that they'd give them to him, but only on 2 conditions. The first being that Ryan would hand over the Eye of Viseroth. Rovath and Sindora needed something to quell the angered Chronodragonus. The second was that Ryan would occasionally send humans to their domain in Untempera through the same energy field being created by the Lightmaster engines, so that Rovath and Sindora could make their warriors of Untempera. This time not to wipe out opposition, but to stabilize and protect the peace throughout the rest of Panomni. Ryan agreed, and left Untempera with the Lightmaster engines in hand. The day of reckoning was here. The ship was built, and it was massive, roughly the size of your average white dwarf star. Jeffrey dubbed it the Landstar, for a rather silly reason. It's the size of a star, and you can land on it! It didn't go over well, but the name did stick for Ryan and Stellius. The humans of Pangaea were taken to the Landstar via a class of specialized planetary evacuation craft called Thunderbirds. Not all humans left the Earth, however. When the order was called to evacuate the planet, the people of Sunstroke, who typically lived underground, cut themselves off from the outside world and locked themselves inside. They were never seen again. As the remaining Thunderbirds approached the Landstar, a Ulyssian craft carrying an Ultrafusion deployed its payload to the star Sol, which upon making contact, began to expand, destroying the Earth in the process. The human race watched in horror as their home was disintegrated by the power of the star that had nurtured their very beings. Stellius too was horrified. She was worried that she was going too far by helping these people. They weren't safe here on the Landstar, and she knew it. They'd have to be on the run constantly if they were going to survive, and she couldn't back away from her deal. Her warrior's code wouldn't allow it. She confronted Ryan, frustrated and upset with him for putting her in such a situation where her only salvation was this rather pathetic race of mortals. Ryan, unexpectedly, was angered by this. "Every immortal I have met," said Ryan, "has told me that these humans are tiny, insignificant mortals who will die out. Why? Because they will die? Because they live smaller lives than us? Well, you know what, I disagree. These mortals are more than just another doomed race. To me, they represent all life in the universe. When I stand with them, I feel like they are the giants and I a parasite, except I will be a parasite no longer. I will do whatever it takes to protect them. You can do whatever you want. If you want to take this as your part of our arrangement fulfilled, then so be it. I will not struggle." Ryan turned his back to Stellius and closed his eyes. Stellius was once again shocked by Ryan's response. She looked over at the humans scattering about the ship, gawking at its design. As she did, she felt something she didn't fully understand. It was pride, but not in her beliefs or in anyone else. It was pride in what she had done. She had made the ship, the Landstar, and when she saw these humans of whom she had built it for looking at it and being amazed by its structure and design, she felt happy, accomplished. She turned back to Ryan and said, "Fine, I will help you, not for your sake, but for theirs." Ryan turned back round, happy that Stellius understood what it was he was fighting for. Stellius then asked, as a symbol of her going into hiding, that her name be changed to Stellia until such time as she was to return. Ryan asked what she would say to her generals if or when she did go back, to which Stellia simply responded that she'd think of something. Jeffrey would live to be well over 100 years old. He was seen as the founder of the Landstar by the others. Jeffrey had never believed anything in his life would bear fruit, yet here he was, one of the greatest saviors in human history. In his final moments of life, he turned to Ryan and asked what he saw in humans that would drive him to be so protective of them. Ryan simply responded that he saw joy in peace, something that, as a Yotan, he had not seen before. Jeffrey laughed. His last words were, "You can't help but be corny, can you?" Ironically, the system of governing on the Landstar became a sort of dictatorship. Ryan and Stellius were decidedly made monarchs of the ship, as it was they who brought it into existence. They disguised themselves as humans and told the mortal humans that they were made immortal by some kind of accident in a special pre-developed device called the Genesis Forge. Despite it being a long shot, many were satisfied with the answer, and they were henceforth referred to as the Father King and the Mother Queen. Stellius didn't like that she was implied to be in a relationship with Ryan, but couldn't really do anything about it. The two made sure that the people of the Landstar had plenty of everything they needed. They gave people jobs, training, schooling, entertainment, and if it all wasn't enough, they were more than welcome to find a new planet on which to make a home on, separated from the Landstar. A new system of time was also implemented. It was pretty much the same, 365 days in a year, every fourth year is a leap year. But the first year of the current era was when the Earth was destroyed. They kept things within tradition mainly to prevent confusion, but also to make the Landstar feel more like home. And that was how it was. For over 130 years, the Landstar would discover many things about the galaxy and colonize or document 4.7 billion planets. There would be alien first contacts, hostile threats, super advanced forms of hyperspace travel, and inventions in technology, including the creation of Star Captains, which was Ryan's answer to Rovath and Sindora's request to create warriors of Untempera. The human race prospered and became far more than what Ryan had ever anticipated. It was a golden age for humanity, despite what some might think. With every group of colonists the Landstar was sending to different planets, Ryan was making sure that they were given a strange and inconspicuous cube. He told the colonists it was part of a navigational system for the ships they were given. This was a lie. The cubes were actually advanced spatial cameras that would be on the lookout for any Yotan or Ulyssian forces. This would help the Landstar avoid contact with either faction while keeping an eye on any contact the colonists had with them. Unfortunately for Ryan, one of the human colonies would discover what it actually is the cubes were before any contact was even made. Furthermore, this colony was known for its distaste for the Landstar and its monarchy. This led to a battle between the colonists and the Landstar, which then further distracted Ryan and Stellius from the fact that they were now right in the crossfire of a Yotan fjord ship and a Ulyssian eagle war nest. The battle would become known as the Battle of the Crossroads. Now taking hits from all sides and unable to fight off everything at once, Ryan left Stellius to organize defenses while he sought a plan for the Landstar to escape from its inevitable destruction. His last hope was to turn to his former gods. He begged and pleaded with them to save the Landstar, that even if the warriors of Untempera defeated both the Yotans and Ulyssians, it would be at the cost of too many human lives to be worth any victory. Not only that, but it would make the Landstar a target for both factions. Rovath and Sindora were hesitant. Interfering like this had never been done before, not even by the Chrono-Dragonus. They wished that they had never been put in this position. Why couldn't everyone just leave them alone? The Dragonus hadn't been too happy despite receiving the Eye of Viseroth, as it further increased tensions between the siblings. What they wouldn't give for some peace. Then they realized something. Ryan wanted peace too. The Yotans normally actually enjoy a good fight. Money to be made, fun weapon ideas to explore, but Ryan, he wanted none of that. What was it that made him so different? So they made Ryan a proposition. "The Landstar for your life," they said. "We can save your mortal children, but we must have your life in return, so that we might stop the spread of the chaos at its roots. What do you say, Father King?" Ryan had a lot to think about. Could he leave the Landstar behind? Would it be safe? No, of course it would be. He trusted Stellius. Them being safe was not the problem. The problem was what the people of the Landstar would become. How would the command shift under Stellius alone? Ryan felt he had no choice, but he asked for one condition: to deliver a message to his frightened people. to help them one last time. Rovath and Sindora agreed, and so the Landstar was moved or teleported 100 million light-years away to a galaxy where the war between the Jotans and the Ulyssians would be barely but a glimmer in the empty. Ryan returned one last time and gave a speech that would be heard across the Landstar and ring clear in the ears of all the citizens that remained. Ryan wanted to say so much, but knew it would take him a full human lifetime. Eventually, he realized that the most important thing to say at that moment were 3 words. "You're safe now." And with those words spoken, he passed back into Untempera, where Rovath and Sindora were waiting to bring into existence a new, peaceful king. The casualties of the battle were high. Not only were people killed, but there were people who had departed from the Landstar during the fight that hadn't been teleported with it. The remaining people on the Landstar would find themselves in the galaxy called Hoag's Object. But none of that mattered at the time. What did matter was re-establishing order on the ship. The Mother Queen, now the Overqueen, was most definitely a strong leader, and spent a lot of time reinforcing the resolve of the scared and battered citizens. Over time, however, it was clear to a significant portion of them that Stellius did things a lot differently than before. This was because over the last 100 or so years, Stellius had actually developed feelings for Ryan. He had helped her with so much, so frequently without her realizing, and to suddenly not have him around anymore was a real punch to the gut that no one could understand. Without any way to vent this frustration, Stellius had no choice but to hold everything back. This worked for a while, until pressure was applied by a new threat to the Landstar. During the recuperating effort of the Landstar, many wanted to go back and explore worlds again. In this new galaxy, there were many new wonders to be discovered. The Overqueen wanted this also, but realized without assured protection, there was no point in exploring when potential dangers brought in by these exploration missions could further threaten the Landstar. She tried her hardest to make people see the possible threats, but it came off as fear-mongering. This led a group of 500,000 people led by a young scientist to leave the Landstar and search for a planet that was considered to be not too dissimilar from Earth. These people believed that Stellius was becoming a tyrant, and they weren't wrong, but it would take a big event to tip Stellius over the edge. Enter Gypsia. Gypsia had an odd history. The planet's creation and species of origin were simple enough to understand: a darkened landscape lit by a cold fire sun, and a species with vein lines permanently molded into their skin. But when an entire army of vampires from Queria appeared and decided to colonize, things got complicated, to say the least. At first, the idea was that the vampires would aid in Gypsia's blood problem. The species of origin, the Gypsons, found that their bodies produced too much blood, and the vampires could easily deal with those issues. Despite the fact that the vampires were from Queria, their leader, the First Blood Emperor, was actually a former pure-blooded human. No one knows how this transpired. Even the Blood Emperor himself has no idea. Maintaining peace between the vampires and Gypsons was his primary goal, but it came at the cost of some necessary evils. Businesses ran on blood, depended on it. There were even cartels, and the galactic black market of Hoag's Object got involved as soon as they found out there were profits to be gained and souls to be sold. Blood to these Querian vampires is the elixir of life. One sip was enough to heal anything from minor scratches to third-degree burns. On top of that, it has an addictive quality to it. So, as one can imagine, the vampires had many ways to enjoy blood. They used it for food seasoning, drank it, mixed it with a variety of beverages. The Blood Emperor's very own advisor was quite adept with blood cooking, but some preferred to take the blood directly from the source. These vampires eventually created a group called the True Blood Hunters. They were vampires who would simply take blood whenever they needed it, and found a thrill in the hunt of preying upon the unaware. Their leader, a man who chose to go by the name of Master, also developed an ability to control and manipulate the blood around him, and would be able to bestow this power to his most trusted followers as well. As a counter to these true blood hunters, the Gypsons established a hate group against vampires. Gav, Gypsons Against Vampires, would regularly send death threats to the vampirical dynasty, telling them to leave or die. Vampire businesses were attacked regularly, riots occurred in which many were killed, and the Blood Emperor, under the ever-watchful eye of the Gypsum government, was afraid to make any action too aggressive, lest it be taken as an act of war. The balance of power was fragile for many years, that is until the Landstar was discovered. At this point in time, the Blood Emperor hadn't seen another human in thousands of years, and yet was most definitely curious about what had happened during the time that had elapsed. He sent an envoy to meet the Landstar and requested an audience with its leading class. There, the envoy discovered many things about humans, including a unique effect the vampires had over them. The natural speech patterns of the vampires are incredibly seductive to humans. To the envoy, this was a bit strange. They were just simply talking normally, but for some reason the humans would hang off their every word. When relayed back to the Blood Emperor, he knew he had made a grave mistake by going to the Landstar. Information is passed around easily on Gypsia, and a new source of prey would not be an opportunity the true blood hunters would pass up. And so, the kidnappings began. At first, only one human was taken, but over time, dozens, if not hundreds more, were captured directly from the Landstar. The panic was beginning to set in. Gypsia orbits a cold-fire sun called St. Graft. The sun emits a light that is comfortable for vampires during the day, but it also has a secondary effect. From a distance away from the planet, the light from St. Graft blends the planet into the blackness of space, practically turning Gypsia invisible. This would be its most valuable defense against the humans, who were starting to become more aggressive, even feral, in their desperate search for these kidnapping vampires. The Overqueen needed help. The other powers in the galaxy, such as Trenforia, a delivery company that has a not-so-secret black market ring, weren't willing to help in any way to end the war, especially when there were so many assets on Gypsia. And of course, war is good for business. Trenforia also had a stranglehold on every other power, preventing anyone from even touching the conflict between the Landstar and Gypsia. To make matters worse, the true blood hunters had amassed a large enough population to launch full-scale raids on the Landstar regularly. The Blood Emperor had made it illegal to hunt on Gypsia, but there was no law like that towards hunting on the Landstar. Stellius was on her own, so she took it upon herself to build up her own forces by creating more star captains. Believing she could do it in bulk, she handpicked with relative haphazardness around 1,000 humans and sent them into Untempera through the Lightmaster engines, but unfortunately, out of the 1,000, only 3 returned. And despite how powerful they were, the ends did not justify the means, and Stellia's forces dwindled further. She did find an alternative solution. By exposing humans to raw, untempered radiation from the Lightmaster engines, she could create a lesser version of the standard Star Captain. She had created a new subcategory of humans referred to as Huma Alters, not as powerful as Star Captains, but not without powers either. These Huma Alters had nothing but contempt for their attackers, and fought back viciously alongside the Star Captains whenever a raid was in progress. They weren't a sure victory for the Landstar, but it did create a stalemate. Back on Gypsia, the anti-vampire group known as Gav had discovered what the true blood hunters were doing to the Landstar. Gav had been rescuing the human captives who were brought back to Gypsia and vowed to help them return one day, but it was clear to these humans that Gav was far from in control of their own planet, so a new plan was proposed. It wasn't a pretty one, but it was an ending. No one knows who came up with the plan. All that is known is that if the suffering was to end, this had to be done. One of the new star captains, who went by the name of Ragnar, had a powerful ability to create undying, unending fire. The Gypsians had watched through their telescopes as Ragnar demonstrated this power on a nearby asteroid belt during an attack on the true blood hunters. The Gypsians watched with horrified amazement as the belt was engulfed in flame for weeks to the point where there was nothing but charred landscape. The goal of the plan was to get the humans off Gypsia and have Ragnar burn the planet by setting up a massive beacon across the planet that would give away the location of Gypsia to the Landstar. The Gypsians would commit suicide if it meant an end to the vampires. At the end of it all, however, no one on Gypsia was spared. Not vampire, nor Gypsian, nor human. The planet was burned, purged of all life. Ragnar made sure to let the fire on Gypsia never die out so that no life could ever recover. From that day on, Gypsia was a hell world. Stellia, steeled by this victory and furious at the rest of the galaxy for their refusal to aid the Landstar despite it all, came to a decision. The Landstar would be a force of justice in Hoag's object, but from the perspective of the citizens of the galaxy, the Landstar didn't bring justice. It brought Armageddon. In their tongue, the Landstar and its machinations were named the War Star and its Screaming Angels. Stellia believed she was dispensing justice. In reality, she was looking for the next fight to pick. For years, she terrorized the galaxy and burned countless worlds. Despite having an era of peace for over 130 years, the Overqueen's rule lasted 150 years. When once before the human race colonized worlds and built societies, now they reduced society to little more than ash and the distant echoes of dying screams. In the year 305, Stellia not only had made enemies across the galaxy, but on the Landstar itself. The people had come to realize what the once great Mother Queen had fallen to. They were sad to see it, but knew the only way to get through to her at this point was rebellion. At first, peaceful protests were sought, but that quickly dissolved when Stellia commanded 2 star captains to quell the citizens. A lot of blood was spilled that day. The conflict now faced by Stellia was against her own people, and it would have been the end for the Landstar if it weren't for a strange visitor, a faceless woman of starlight who came to ask for help against a new threat to the galaxy. Her name is Solara. I fear that's all I have time for. I'm really pushing writing this as it is. There are things I didn't mention, such as King Andromeda, Fedoria, the space neckbeard mafia weebs. I also wanted to set up some lore behind the Space Pirate Saga and Thunderhive. I hope that over time I will introduce each and every one of you to all of it. As I said before, this world and all it has to offer means everything to me, and I hope to one day turn this into something that could get an official series maybe. And with all of you backing me, I think I can actually do that. Until then, I'll see you soon. Oh, and yes, I am still working on Space Pirate Saga Season 2, but I wanted to show off a few more pilots first. I'm sure you don't mind. Thank you to everyone for supporting me thus far. I'll see you all really soon. From his home, as well as using the eye of his deceased father to do it. What the hell was that? I just threw up in my mouth. Oh, that was scary. Oh, fuck. Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Oh, God. Good God. Alright. Good God. That was fucking terrifying. I just threw up in my mouth. Fucking hell. I'll be fine. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. Jesus Christ. First I dislocate my leg, now I'm throwing up in my mouth. What's next? Okay, moving on. I lost my place. Shit.